Well, I hope you can hear me well, right? I, in fact, am coming from a 30-minute conversation with your president, with your rector. And then I guess maybe I can start from what our conversation was between your rector and myself. Your rector was talking about how Uzbekistan became one of the independent states after 1991. And at the time, how he thought it was important for Uzbekistan to establish an educational institution where future diplomats, future government officials, and future leaders of Uzbekistan would be educated. And I was listening to him, and I could perfectly understand what he was talking about. Why? Because in Korea, the modern-day Korean government, we often are proud about 5,000 years of Korean history. But at the same time, modern government of Korea was inaugurated in 1948. And one of the first challenges that we had to address was to set up educational institutions to train the future leaders of Korea. So when your rector talked about how this university was started at that time, 1991, 1992, I could fully understand what he was telling me, but at the same time, I said to myself, well, I'm speaking to the future of Uzbekistan here today. And I said to myself, I, in fact, should be very nice to you. You are future leaders of Uzbekistan. So having said that, let me just start with the main theme for today, which is Korea's economic diplomacy, challenges and responses. This is my favorite graph. Can you hear me? I think this microphone works even better, right? This is my favorite graph. Why? Because this graph shows per capita GDP for Korea for the past 60 years. So it starts with per capita GDP of Korea in 1953. As you can see, at the very left bottom of the graph, it was almost non-existent. I'm talking about 1953, when Korean War came to an end. At the time, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, if not the poorest. Today, well, this graph ends at 2013. Today, in 2019, per capita GDP of Korea is 34,000. So we came a long way. And how did it happen? Well, I think it happened because of many different factors put together. One of them was let individuals like you to take advantage of the opportunity to work at your best. Study hard, work hard, improve yourself, and that way contribute to the country, right? Second of all, I think we were very lucky that we had leaders with vision. Vision, how to take best advantage of this aspiration of each and every individual, and then put the energy to the development of the country. Third factor, again, I think we were lucky to have large number of very capable government officials. That's who you are. You are preparing to become future government leaders and future leaders of this country. When I talk about future government, when I talk about the third factor, that is to say, very capable government leaders or bureaucrats, of course there were bureaucrats of all different kinds. Economists, bankers, diplomats, and diplomats was one of them. And today, I'm not going to talk about economists. I'm not going to talk about bankers. I'm going to talk about diplomats. Why? Because I'm a diplomat. Having said that, 60 years is a long time. So I just want to split those 60 years into 5 different periods.
So 1948 to 60, and 61 to 79, 1980 to 97, 1997 to 2016, and then the final last period would be from 2017 on. For each period, I will share with you what the challenges were for each period and how we responded to those challenges for each period. So this would be the rule of the game. I will talk about challenges and responses of the first period. After that, I will make a pause, take a pause, and give you the floor so that I will hear from you about your views on what you just heard from me. And then we will move on to the second period, third period, etc., etc. Are you happy with that? You understand the rule of the game? Can I hear louder response? Yes. Do you understand? Yes. Well, if you understand and the support, then I think you could start by giving me a big applause. Thank you. So I will start with the first period. In the first period, that is from 1948 to 1960. What was the challenges of the time? The challenges of the time was, this is something I already told you. Korea was very, very poor. We didn't have too much to eat. We didn't have too much to burn, to heat our homes. Absolute poverty. So challenge of the time was survival, how to survive. That was the challenge of the time. Korean per capita GDP, it was below $100, could be below $50. So survival was a challenge. Then how did we respond? We responded with a lot of foreign aid. A lot of it came from the United States. But at the same time, some of it came from UN agency called UNCRA, United Nations Korea Reconstruction Agency. But there was something interesting about the nature of support for Korea, which is when we talk about foreign aid for developing countries, it is mostly in the area of health, public health, and education. But in case of Korea, somehow large percentage of it was industrial goods or industrial materials. So that, I think, was something unique about ODA to Korea. Still more unique about ODA this period of Korean economy at the time was somehow the director of UNCRA, I told you about UN agency, United Nations Korea Reconstruction Agency, that director took note of something rather unique about Korea, which is Koreans, they were at the receiving end of ODA, Overseas Development Agency. They, in fact, were not just sitting there to receive it and spend it. They, in fact, just took it as a kind of material which they must utilize to develop Korean economy. In other words, the spirit of self-help. That, in fact, was something which was took note of by the director for UNCRA at the time. Another unique aspect of this period of Korean economy was, well, even if manufacturing sector was very low in terms of its contribution to the Korean GDP, somehow there were already green shoots of Korean industries. So in each area of imminent importance to daily life, there were somehow green shoots of Korean companies, industries, which began its own operation at the time, which, after so many decades, developed into the leading business representatives of Korea today, like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, etc., etc. I told you today's presentation of mine would be on from diplomat's point of view, right? Talking about 1948 to 1960, unfortunately, Foreign Ministry did not have too much role to play. So there is very little for me to say. But there is one thing remarkable about Foreign Ministry of that time, which is Foreign Ministry today, it has about 2,500 people. At that time, 1950s, then how many diplomats did we have? 39. So the Foreign Ministry itself, it increased from 39 diplomats to 2,500 diplomats today. At that time, even if it was so small, 39, we had 3 bureaus. One of the bureau was International Trade Bureau. So in other words, even at that such early stage, my predecessors understood the importance of international trade. So that was the first period. And you remember the rule of the game. Questions, comments, anything which comes up in your mind. Rule of the game, there are 5 periods. And then for each period, I will explain to you what the challenge was at the time and how we responded to the challenge for each period. And after that, I will open it up for questions and comments. For the first period, I already told you the challenge was survival. Response was, we in fact tided over that difficult time by depending upon a lot of aid. But we were not just there at the receiving end of aid. We in fact were trying to begin to help ourselves. The Director General for that bureau was somebody called Ambassador Choi. And that Ambassador Choi later on became Foreign Minister. And later on, he became Prime Minister, and later on, he became the President of the nation. That happened back in 1979. But during this period of time, he used to be Director General for Trade Bureau. Let me try to tell you what he used to do. Well, I told you, at the time, we used to get a lot of aid from abroad, right? Bilateral. Under the bilateral, I said PL 480. Has anyone heard about PL 480? I'm not surprised. PL 480 stands for Public Law 480. Public law of which country? Public law of the United States. And it was about, well, Uzbekistan is an important agricultural producer. There is another hugely important agricultural producer. That is United States. United States, it was producing huge amount of agricultural products, some of which they couldn't spend. So, in other words, they in fact had superfluous production of agricultural products, and they in fact sent it as a gift to developing countries at the time. It was done under the law of the United States, which was called Public Law 480. So that law, in fact, served as a basis, legal basis, for this aid coming from United States to Korea in the form of agricultural products. This gentleman, Ambassador Choi, he in fact used to be official in charge of negotiating with the United States for the implementation of PL 480. So we call it International Trade Bureau, but at the time it was not so much trade, but it was more international economic cooperation, including implementation of PL 480. Excellent question. Thank you so much. So I just move on to the second phase, which was from 1961 to 1979. Well, again, let me just try to share with you what the challenges were at the time. This period, second period, then Korea was graduating from all those aid programs. And we had to develop our economy. We had to develop our industry. In order to develop your industry, then you need resources. You need money. You need human labor, right? Well, we had a lot of human labor. We didn't have resources. Uzbekistan, you have a lot of natural resources, mining resources, agricultural resources, a lot of resources. In Korea, we didn't have natural resources. We didn't have money. But we had to develop our economy. So what did we do? That was the challenge. We had to develop our industry when we didn't have sufficient funding, when we didn't have sufficient natural resources. So what did we do? What were Korea's responses? We thought the only way we could develop our economy was through exported-oriented industrialization. Because it was only through export that we could be importing materials, that we could be, in fact, earning money to develop our economy. So that, in fact, was one of the very few options available to Korea at the time. So we started something called 5-year economic development plan. So that 5-year economic development plan started in 1962. And then the focus of the plan was very clear. The focus was how to develop our export sector. So that was the very clear focus. And in order to promote that, then of course, we had to join the GATT. I know a large number of you are studying at the Faculty of International Economics, right? Who are students of Faculty of International Economics? Wow. Then who are studying under the Faculty of International Relations? Then who are studying under the Faculty of International Law? Wow. Well, how do you explain this imbalance? In the sense that there are far larger number of students studying under the Faculty of International Economics and International Law, and so few who are studying under International Relations. Why? Anybody would be willing to tell me that? Why there are so few students studying under the Faculty of International Relations? Okay, if you are still shy, then let me just move on, which is 1967, we decided to join GATT. Now, this is a question for students studying at Faculty of International Economics. Why do you think Korea decided to join GATT in 1967? There were a large number of you, students of Faculty of International Economics. Why do you think Korea decided to join GATT in 1967?
Well, I think that you have joined to GATT because you wanted to have access to the members of the GATT to export your various goods.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then as a matter of fact, one of the huge advantage provided by or provided through joining GATT was something called MFN, I don't have to explain to you about MFN, most favored nation treatment, right? Well, the huge advantage of joining GATT at the time was, well, if you want to export your product to say 100 countries, you have to deal with tariff rate, 100 different tariff rates, if you have to do it yourself. And you will have to deal with 100 different set of tariff rates, right? But if you join GATT, then you in fact would be making yourself enjoy one single tariff rate, which is MFN tariff rate. That in fact was the huge advantage of GATT membership. But that advantage was available to you only after paying the price. And what was the price? Price was, well, we had to open our own market. So it was give and take. Well, let me remind you, Korea at the time was a very poor country. Korea at the time was desperate to develop its export sector. And Korea at the time was, in a sense, had to join GATT in order to develop our export sector. Other members of GATT understood it very well. So they, in fact, were, I have to say, rather generous in conducting accession negotiation with GATT. They did not expect Korea to be opening up our market in a huge manner. The first line of tariffs we had to open at the time in order to join GATT was no more than 60. When tariff lines could have been as many 6,000. We in fact were expected to open only 60 lines of tariff, which improved or increased to 10% by the time of Tokyo round negotiation, and which increased to 90% by the time of Uruguay round negotiation. But we could join it back in 1967 by opening only about 1% of Korea's tariff lines.
I'm sorry, good evening. So I have one question. Okay, you opened your market to the world trading. So didn't you afraid of such situation as maybe your goods will be replaced by the goods which are better quality, better than your goods? And I mean, didn't you afraid of this? Your good can be just replaced with the better goods which are better quality. And how do you think would they be accepted as enough good items in the world trade market?
Well, this is a third question, but my impression is this third question is not too different from the second question. So can I just remind you about the second question? At the same time, just try to remember well, I made 3 points in my answer to the second question. My first point was, so far as Korea was concerned, we in fact were not raising question at that time, 1962, 1967. That in fact was a luxury for Korea at the time. We didn't have any choice. But that question arose in 1980s. That question arose in 1980s in Korea. So have patience and then wait for my discussions on Korean economic policy in 1980s. All right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So this, I think, is a perfect timing to be moving on to the third period. Why? Because in the first period, the challenge was absolute poverty. Second period, the challenge was industrialization against the backdrop of shortage of capital and shortage of natural resources. Now we are moving on to the third period from 1980 to 1997. What was the challenge of this time? In this period, 1980, then we had to face two different kinds of challenges. From outside of Korea, we in fact were beginning to be, in a sense, subject to something called trade remedy measures. When I say trade remedy measures, that includes anti-dumping tariffs, that include safeguard measures, that include countervailing measures. That started from 1980s. So that, in fact, was a pressure coming from abroad. And I told you, when Korea tried to join GATT in 1967, Korea was one of the poorest countries, and GATT member countries, they did not demand heavy cost from Korea. But 1980s, things changed. Korean economy came up, and other economies were saying, now you are no longer a small boy. Now you are now a middle-sized boy. You now have to play according to the international rules. And they were saying, if you're dumping, then you will have to pay dumping tariffs. If you're inundating our market, then you will be subjecting yourself to safeguard measures. If you're providing illegal subsidy, then you will have to pay countervailing tariffs. That, in fact, was a pressure coming from outside of Korea. But at the same time, apart from the pressure coming from abroad, we, in our own economy, in our own market, we were feeling the pressure. What kind of pressure was it? It was the pressure of lagging productivity. Productivity was not increasing as fast as it used to. That's something we used to call at the time as sclerosis of the Korean economy. So economists and government officials and political leaders, they had to face this double challenge. Challenge coming from abroad and challenge coming from within our own society. That was the challenge of 1980s at the time. How did we try to respond to those challenges coming from abroad as well as from within our own economy? Through further liberalization. So I told you, in the second period, we started 5-year economic development plan. That started in 1962. In this period, third period, we in fact introduced something called tariff reduction plan, 5-year tariff reduction plan. So there was a second question, and there was a third question, and both questions were, well, if you have to reduce a tariff, were you not afraid in the sense that you're opening your market to competition coming from better quality products coming from abroad? Well, that discussion was there. But at the same time, this is what I already told you. Well, we were concerned about it on the one hand. On the other hand, we had to deal with a situation where we, in fact, were being subject to all those measures, trade measures coming from developed economies. But at the same time, we saw the necessity to improve our own productivity, and we thought opening up Korean economy would, in fact, be one efficient way of promoting your productivity. So that, in fact, was a discussion of time. Economists, government officials, and political leaders, they decided upon this 5-year tariff reduction plan. So that, in fact, would be one remarkable example of the distance, economic distance, which had been covered by Korea between 1962 and then 1983. So we, in fact, very systematically continue to reduce our tariff voluntarily. I have to emphasize voluntarily. There was no outside pressure as such. It was our own plan of reducing tariff rate for 10 years. So before this plan, the average tariff rate was 23.7%. After 10 years, it came down to 7.9%. Again, there was no outside pressure. We just did it voluntarily. And then as a matter of fact, related liberalization measures would be, well, again, there is Faculty of International Economics, and then you would understand about Article 8 of IMF Articles of Agreement. That is, well, under that article, you in fact are allowed to impose certain exceptions to measures on current account related accounts, right? We declared our graduation from Article 8. Another related article is Article 18 of GATT agreement, again, balance of payment exceptions. We declared our graduation from that Article 18 as well. All of it culminated in Korea joining OECD in 1996, December 1996. Again, question for students at the Faculty of International Economics. You know OECD. You don't? At least some of you would understand OECD. So would you be kind enough to explain to other students what OECD stands for? I'm calling Faculty of International Economics, OECD. You are Googling? Would somebody kind enough? Yeah.
Well, it is the abbreviation of Organization of Economic Collaboration and Development. So,
Great. Let's give them a big hand.
yeah.
And let me just try to tell you about why Korea decided to join OECD at the time, that is to say 1996. By the way, I in fact happened to be one of the team negotiating Korea's accession to the OECD. Again, there was no pressure. Again, it was out of our own voluntary decision that we decided to join OECD. And in order to do that, then Korea had to undergo something called examination at no less than 11 OECD committees, which required Korea to introduce large number of further liberalizations into Korean economy-related regulations. Again, nobody pressured Korea to join OECD. We voluntarily joined OECD. And as I repeat myself, Korea had to introduce drastic measures of liberalization in 11 different areas. Why did Korea do that? Because we thought, again, by opening your economy further, wider, then you in fact would be able to further, well, in a sense, stimulate Korean economy to reach higher goal of competitiveness. That was the belief. And that's what we did at the time, back in 1996. '40s, then what I'm suggesting to do is why GATT in the first place was started. GATT was started in the first place to deal with the lessons learned from 1930s. So when I say lessons learned from 1930s, then what comes up in your mind? Lessons learned from 1930s. When I say 1930s, then what comes up in your mind? Great Depression, right? Great Depression. Well, again, Faculty of International Economics, you must have learned about Smooth-Hawley Act. Smooth-Hawley Act. Smooth, Holy Act. Smooth, Mr. Holy. Both of them were US politicians of the time. One of them was a senator, another was member of the House. I forgot which one was the senator and then which one was the member of the House. But anyhow, there was Great Depression. And Mr. Smooth and Mr. Holy, they believed US economy would be aided greatly if United States raises its tariff rate significantly higher in order to stop the import of products from abroad. That was the belief of Mr. Smooth and Mr. Holy. And that's the reason why that Smooth-Holy Act enjoyed widespread support in the US Congress. And that act was passed. What happened? Did it help to save US economy from Great Depression? Just the other way around. It in fact facilitated, expedited the spread of depression, Great Depression in the US economy. So that in fact was a very important lesson learned by the United States, learned by the whole world. So that in fact is the reason why 1940s, 1941, when United States decided to enter World War II after Pearl Harbor bombing by Japan, then FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was determined that in fact, well, by the way, there is this famous fireside chat by Franklin Delano Roosevelt he gave on December 9th of 1941, and then what he said was, citizens of the United States, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We, United States, we are entering the war. And then you listen to me very carefully. We will win the war, right? And he said, we in fact are going to win the peace, which comes after that. I really like this speech. He said, well, fellow citizens, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We are entering war. So you can understand, he said, we are going to win the war. But he added, but we are going to win the peace after we win the war. That's what he said. And this is not what he just said. He prepared for that. In other words, he, even at the height of World War II, he was preparing for the launching of the United Nations system. He was preparing for launching IMF. He was preparing for launching World Bank. He was preparing to launching something called ITO, International Trade Organization. It didn't happen. ITO, FDR failed to launch ITO. But at the same time, at the least, he could start GATT. So that's how GATT came about. And I'm just, well, saying this in response to this question coming from this friend of yours. What does it mean? What it means is, this is in fact such an important lesson we learned, not out of textbook, not out of lazy imagination. This in fact is a very precious lesson we learned out of actual fact, right? Which is, protectionism does not help the economy. So that in fact is the reason why we today, I mean this is something we are going to discuss again in the fifth period. We again, when there are so many, I wouldn't call it protectionism, I would call them protectionist measures. Protectionist measures are taking place, being taken in such a large number of countries. Why we should be concerned? Because that's what we learned out of history. That doesn't help your economy, right? Any other question for the third period? If not, we will move on to the fourth period. fourth period, what were the challenges? Well, somehow, in the fourth period, beginning from 1997 up until 2016, we had succession of economic crisis or financial crisis. In 1997, in our own country, Korea, we had something called Asian financial crisis. 10 years later, in 2008, there was something called global financial crisis. So they were the challenges. How did we cope with those challenges in 1997 and 2008? I just told you about Smooth Holy. Facing such challenges, crisis, did we try to introduce protective measures, protectionist measures? No. We just went other way around. We thought in order to deal with new challenges, the best way to deal with these new challenges would be through further liberalization. That's what we did. So in 1997, 1998, in response to the Asian financial crisis, we introduced 4 reform measures in 4 different sectors. And in 1998, we started something called FTAs. Before 1998, we didn't have any FTA at all. Our trading regime was wholly based upon GATT/WTO, which we call multilateral trading system. And up until that time, that is to say 1998, we thought FTAs would undermine multilateral trading system. That, in fact, was the reason why we intentionally kept away from FTAs. But by 1998, what was happening at that time was WTO was launched in 1998, and it was our expectation this inauguration of WTO would stop the spread of FTAs. But we were proven wrong. Somehow, even after the inauguration of WTO in 1995, there was proliferation of FTAs. And by 1998, we changed our mind. And then we began to think, liberalization is liberalization. Whether it is done multilaterally through WTO, or whether it is done regionally or bilaterally through FTA, liberalization is liberalization. We, in order to deal with this crisis, would have to go in the direction of further liberalization. And that, in fact, was the background against which we made a decision to go into FTA arrangements beginning from 1998. And in 2008, global financial crisis started. And I was listening to President Sarkozy of France. He came to speak in September of 2008 at the United Nations General Assembly. And he said, well, this financial crisis is a global financial crisis. And in order to respond to this global financial crisis, it in fact would be necessary for us to coordinate globally our response. And then he said this, who will do that? Who will do this coordination in our response to the global financial crisis? He said, G7, would G7 be able to do that? And he answered himself by saying, well, it's too small. We need something larger. That's what I heard from President Sarkozy's speech. And I was listening to him, and I said to myself, I do not know what form that expanded global governance grouping would look like. Would it be G7-18, no, I'm sorry, G13, G16, G18, or G20? I do not know what the final shape will be. But at that time, I was working as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then what I said to myself was that, well, definitely it should be G20. If it is global coordinating grouping to take the place of G7, definitely it should be G20. Not G13, not G16, not G18. It must be G20. That's what I said to myself. Why? Why do you think I said that? Well, the answer is simple, because Korea was not part of G13, G16, or G18. Korea was part of G20. So that's the reason why I said it must be G20. So, well, this is something I already told you. I mean, when Korea made up its mind to join GATT in 1967, I already told you, we didn't have a choice. We had to do that, right? That's what we thought at the time. And this time around, when it was being suggested to, well, in a sense, expand G7 to something larger, I said to myself, it should be G20. Why? Because Korea is in G20 alone. So having set that as a goal, then we had to develop justification. We had to develop the logic. And then, fortunately, we could find a very strong logic. The logic was, there in fact was something called G20 Finance Ministers meeting. So our logic was, why do we have to invent a new vehicle? There is already G20. So the only thing we have to do is enhance G20 from ministerial meeting to the head of government meeting. That was our logic. Somehow that logic was adopted by a large number of countries and started G20 process. In addition to Korea joining G20 as a member, what is even more important is what Korea tried to achieve through Korea's membership in G20. What Korea tried to achieve was, well, in fact, there were several different objectives that we pursued. One of them was, well, in fact, further liberalization. Why? Because out of our own confidence that in order to deal with the crisis, financial crisis, protectionism is not an answer. Further liberalization, in fact, it would raise many challenges, but we don't have any other option. That, in fact, was our belief, and that, in fact, was something we wish to do through participation in the G20 process. Any further question? Well, if not, we are beginning to lose students. So I think I better pick up speed, right? So the fifth period, that starts from 2017. And what is the challenge we face in the fifth period? Well, there are a large number of challenges. That student of yours, he just mentioned about unemployment. He just mentioned about illegal immigration. But at the same time, the challenge I'm going to discuss with you today is challenge to the multilateral trading system. And then this is a question which this student raised. Multilateral trading system is being rather seriously challenged today. From time to time, I just wonder about why. Why today? And I told you about how GATT was started back in 1940s, right? So it was just being received as grain of faith. In the sense, GATT, WTO/GATT, WTO, in fact, is an indispensable institution for international trading system. That was received as an article of faith for almost 70 years. Why it is being challenged today? I think there are at least 3 reasons why multilateral trading system is being challenged as seriously as today. Number 1, spread of anger and, in a sense, discontent, which became increasingly imminent and evident beginning from 2011. When I say 2011, I'm talking about something called 99% 1% movement. Do you remember that? 99% 1%. Do you remember that? Maybe you are too young about it. But back in 2011, there was crisis, something called Euro crisis. and large number of West European economies like Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, they began to experience serious economic crisis at the time. And not only that, that ignited a movement called 99% versus 1%, meaning they were out on the street protesting about inequality, inequality of income, inequality of wealth. And they were saying much of it comes from neoliberalism. Much of it comes from globalization. Much of it comes from free trade. That's what we began to hear in 2011. And at the time, people were saying, for the time being, is limited to small group of countries, is limited to small group of people, but if it spreads to large number of people, to large number of countries, it could in fact develop into political actions and political movement. That in fact was something I began to hear back in 2011. Today, what is happening? We in fact see widespread expressions of this anger across the whole world. Look at Latin America. Look at Middle East. Look at Western Europe. Look at United States. So this widespread dissatisfaction with income inequality and wealth inequality, that I think is the first reason. Second reason, change in technology. Change in technology, in fact, is leading to something called decoupling. And what I mean by decoupling would be this, which is decoupling of growth and jobs. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, economic growth eventually ended up in large number of jobs. And again, decoupling in growth and trade. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when there was a growth, there was growth in trade as well. That, in fact, is not happening. To a large extent, it is, in my mind, it is because of the change in technology. But there is a third factor, and third factor is, well, what in fact is an explanation for income inequality? What is the explanation for its wealth inequality? What is the explanation for, say, in a sense, trade imbalance? Much of it can be explained through difference in macroeconomic policies and difference in technology. But when it comes to large number of politicians, they know it will be taking much efforts and it will be taking much time to address these issues through change of economic policies and rules and regulations. So what do they say? They just join the bandwagon and begin to blame international trade. They begin to blame globalization. So at least these three factors, spread up anger and change in technology and spread up populistic political views, I think all of them are, in a sense, merging to end up in this phenomenon we are observing, which is multilateral trading system being challenged rather seriously. That, in fact, is the challenge we face today. How do we respond? I think, well, we have to begin by reminding ourselves about what worked over the past 70 years and what didn't work over the past 70 years. Protectionism didn't work. So we, in fact, have to keep on reminding ourselves about the risk of cheap and easy answers, and we have to remind ourselves about where the problems really lie and what are the necessary, they may be difficult measures, but at the same time, they are necessary measures we should be taking. So that, in fact, would be a huge challenge, and that, in fact, would be our response to be made in Korea, but not only in Korea, across the whole world. So that's my fifth comment, and we'll open up for further questions and comments. Well, Mr. Rector, there is no question and comment. Maybe everybody wishes to just go home.
Please, your question or comments? No. The President, the Ambassador, thank you so much for your visit, for your speech, for your answers.